So I'm going to take you on a little journey back 54 years to September 1970. I was living just outside of Boston in Somerville, a year out of college with a couple of roommates. I remember quite distinctly where I was when I received a phone call from my mother. I can see it now, actually, the place and everything, asking me if I had been following the news. Did I know that my two cousins, her nieces, Martha and Catherine, ages 12 and 13, were on a plane that had been hijacked, that they were sitting in the desert in Jordan right now. They'd been on their way home to New York from Israel, where they had been visiting their mother. They were unaccompanied and on their own. I recall asking lots of questions, and of course, she had no answers. She just said, "Follow the news." I asked how their father, Stuart, my uncle, was doing. She said he was holding up, that he thought that they would be home soon. I hung up and proceeded to follow the news, which in those days meant the Boston Globe, the New York Times, and public radio. I didn't have a television back then, so that was it. Of course, there were phone calls that went back and forth between family members. And each day I scanned the paper for a word of their release or for some positive news. And for quite a while, there wasn't any. They were in that plane for 6 days and 6 nights. I was overjoyed when I read that the hostages had been released and read Catherine's quote in the New York Times. "Now I'm going to thank God and have a bath." Great, I said to myself. They're safe, and it's over. Being the son of 2 newspaper people, I decided they ought to be interviewed. Would that be possible? I made some phone calls to my mother, to Stuart, and the answer, after some hesitation, was yes. I called a friend of mine, a former college roommate, A.J. Sullivan, who is freelancing as a photographer with the Boston Phoenix, the alternative weekly, and asked him to see if they would be interested in an article, an exclusive. "You bet" was the answer, and so we set it up. We drove to New York and interviewed Catherine, Martha, and their father, Stuart, in their apartment. I brought a reel of audio tape so we could record it using a machine provided by my uncle. This was, as you can tell, a family affair. We conducted the interview, the who, what, where, when, and why of the story, but were careful and considerate in our questioning. AJ took some photographs. We went back to Boston, wrote the article, made the deadline, and it was published along with a couple of AJ's photos. When we were done, I put the tape, along with a copy of the story, in a brown manila envelope, placed it on a shelf, and went on with my life. Fast forward 47 years. I said we'd do some time traveling. I was now married and living in Springfield and received an email from Martha in March of 2017. Martha, during this time, had been busy. She held degrees from Bowdoin College, Harvard University, and Princeton University, and was now professor of history at New York University. She had published numerous books, including Mourning Lincoln, that was awarded the Lincoln Prize and named an editor's choice by the New York Times Book Review and a Best Book of the Year by the Wall Street Journal. She was also the author of 2 more award-winning books, The Sea Captain's Wife, A True Story of Love, Race, and War in the 19th Century, and White Women, Black Men, Illicit Sex in the 19th Century South. Her writing had appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, and Los Angeles Times, among other venues. She wrote in her email, "I'm writing now with some questions I wonder if you can answer for me. I've lately been looking into an event from my childhood past, the week of September 1970, that Catherine and I spent on a hijacked plane in the Jordan Desert, held hostage there by the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. In Stuart's apartment, I recently found a clipping of an interview that you did with us that appeared in the October 6, 1970 issue of the Boston Phoenix, co-authored by A.J. Sullivan. Might you have notes from the interview, a fuller transcript, or even a tape?" I realized it was a long, long time ago. My response? Blast from the past. Wow, I haven't thought about that piece for decades, which was true. I'd totally forgotten about it. I had no clue if I still had the tape, or if I had the tape, whether it was still playable. But I did find it in my attic. It was in a box with some bongo drums, and other old stuff, and had apparently traveled with me in my various moves in the Boston area and then out to Springfield. With the help of a great guy up in Florence by the name of Steve Uncles, who has a company called Audiovisual Archives, which I want to give a call out to, we were able to convert the tape for her use. I had a tape machine, and Steve provided me with 3 machines, and one of them worked finally. The rest of the story, of course, is hers to tell, and what a story it is. The title is perfect. My Hijacking, a personal history of forgetting and remembering. Would you please welcome Martha Hodes.
Hello, everybody. Thank you, Jeremy, for that wonderful, very kind introduction. I will be saying more about our 1970 interview later on. And thank you so much, Sid Melcher, for inviting me here tonight, and thank you all for being here. The book Jeremy just mentioned, My Hijacking, A Personal History of Forgetting and Remembering, tells the story of my own and my family's participation, if unwitting, in a world historical event. The 1970 hijackings, as Jeremy said, by the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. I was 12 years old, traveling with my 13-year-old sister Catherine, who is here this evening. We were returning to New York from Tel Aviv, and we were, as Jeremy said, unaccompanied by adults. Our mother had moved to Israel to help start the Batsheva Dance Company under the direction of Martha Graham. Our parents were both modern dancers and both former principal Graham dancers. And my sister and I spent our childhood summers in Israel with our mother. That's me on the left in the summer of 1970 at my mother's Tel Aviv apartment building. And that's my sister Catherine and me practicing our yoga poses on the beach. And that photo on the right was taken the day before we boarded our flight home. On September 6th, 1970, the Popular Front hijacked 4 planes. One was foiled in midair. One was flown to Cairo, evacuated, and blown up. 2 successfully commandeered planes landed in the Jordan Desert, ours, a Transworld Airlines TWA flight, and a Swiss Air flight. 3 days later, the Popular Front successfully hijacked another plane, a British airliner, to the Jordan Desert. Catherine and I were held hostage inside the airplane for a week. Our captors hoped to exchange the passengers and crew for Palestinian prisoners and to bring the plight of Palestinians to the world's attention. I will be turning later in my talk to the present moment, 1 year after October 7th, and the ongoing and now escalating wars. Before I tell you about my hijacking, I'd like to put the Popular Front in some historical and political perspective. The Palestine Liberation Organization, the PLO, was founded in 1964 as an umbrella organization for Palestinian resistance groups. The Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine was founded 3 years later, just after the 1967 Six-Day War. Within the PLO, the Popular Front was a minority, a radical Marxist-Leninist faction. They opposed reactionary Arab governments. They advocated for modernization and women's liberation. Their leaders were drawn from the educated middle and upper classes, doctors, lawyers, intellectuals, although as Marxists, they extolled the working classes and the poor, and they recruited their membership from the refugee camps. Many members of the Popular Front held childhood or young adult memories of losing their homes in 1948 or 1967, or both. The goal of the Popular Front was to transform the state of Israel into a pluralistic, secular state for Jews, Muslims, and Christians. Their method was armed resistance and guerrilla warfare. According to the PLO, quote, everyone except the Popular Front was against hijacking, and it was wrong of the Popular Front to involve the rest of the movement in hijackings. Okay, let me set the scene for you of the hijacking at the outset. Takeoff from Frankfurt was right on schedule at 11:02 a.m. Less than an hour later, as we soared over Belgium, the captain announced an altitude of 28,000 feet. I heard a commotion, shouting that sounded angry, words I didn't understand. A woman was running up the aisle. A man followed, both of them shouting. Some passengers thought the husband and wife were having a fight. Others that the woman was airsick, running to the bathroom to vomit. I saw only a blur, but Catherine saw the man's gun. Others saw the nickel-plated revolver too, along with the woman's finger inserted through the ring of a hand grenade. The purser still thought the man and woman were having an argument with each other, and he ran after them, clapping a hand on the man's shoulder. The man turned around, pointed his gun, and shouted, "Get back, get back." "Oh my God," the purser cried out, "I don't believe it." Just in front of the curtain that led to the first-class cabin, the man and woman turned to the passengers, shouting, "Hijack, hijack." People spoke urgently, if quietly, some exchanging phone numbers and pledging to notify family members should only some of us survive. Soon a woman's voice came over the loudspeaker, which I recorded in my diary this way. "Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I am the new pilot who has taken command of your TWA flight. Keep calm, please cooperate, and put your hands behind your head." Catherine and I copied the other passengers, raising arms and lacing fingers. I wondered why the woman didn't tell us to put our hands over our heads the way robbers did. But she wasn't trying to prevent passengers from drawing weapons. Instead, she needed all of us to brace for impact in case something went wrong inside the cockpit. Our landing was smooth with no damage to the aircraft. Local time was 6:40 p.m., about a quarter hour before sunset. Out the window, we could see billows of dust and sand, which looked like smoke. Commandos on the ground had lined up barrels filled with sand and diesel-soaked rags, and the blazing torches lit up people in military uniforms, which made it look like a war. Someone propped a ladder from the back of the truck up to the plane's front exit. People dressed in fatigues ascended the ladder, armed with flashlights and rifles, lanterns, and machine guns. Some were boys no more than 14 or 15 years old, and some were women with short hair. Listening to my captors, I absorbed both apology and explanation. In one imprinted memory, I watched commandos carry thick yellow cables, the faces of the men expressionless as they go about their task. Although I determined somehow that this was dynamite, there's no memory of accompanying emotion, only the sense of a child intently watching every move. You can see here 2 of the 3 hijacked planes in the Jordan Desert, our TWA airliner on the left and the Swiss airplane on the right, and in between flies the Palestinian flag. Here you can see the desert with a 3rd plane, the BOAC, the British airliner. When I began writing the book, my memories of the hijacking were hazy and fragmented. And many of the memories I held were, odd as this may seem, pleasant ones. Once, when our captors led us outside the plane for fresh air and exercise, one of the commandos joined the children in a game of jump rope, his military boots clanging on the sand. Here's the crew and some of the passengers sitting outside on the sand, and that's our captain on the left. Another day, sitting in the shade under the airplane wing, someone started a round of John Denver's "Leaving on a Jet Plane," which the folk trio Peter, Paul, and Mary had made into a hit single that year. Loud voices among the singing hostages changed the words to "living on a jet plane," which Catherine and I thought was hilarious, and everyone was laughing as we sang the line, "Don't know when I'll be back again," which we changed to "Don't know if I'll be back again." Well, it took me nearly 50 years, But after all that time, I wanted to know more. A historian by trade, I wanted to do more than just excavate my own memories. With a scholar's passion for evidence and accuracy, I wanted to compare memories, compare documents, and compare memories and documents with each other. I wanted to find meaning for everything that had happened to me and my family. I wanted to tell a story that might be meaningful for others, both personally and historically. That meant listening to many voices and reckoning with complexity. I put my memories together with my sisters, talked with my elderly parents, and with childhood friends who remembered that I'd started 7th grade 2 weeks late. I found documents from air traffic control recorded while the hijacking was taking place. At the State Department archives in Washington, I read troves of telegrams and stumbled upon the pages our captors had distributed to us that begun with words I had never forgotten. Ladies and gentlemen, I feel it is my duty to explain to you why we did what we did. At the Richard Nixon Presidential Library in California, I read transcripts of telephone conversations. Should the U.S. threaten to use military force, Secretary of State William Rogers asked one day while my sister and I sat in the desert. No, said National Security Advisor Henry Kissinger, only if any passengers are harmed. We could decide tomorrow, Rogers answered. We still have time. I visited the archives of the International Red Cross in Switzerland. The Red Cross had come on the scene as both negotiators and medics. And I found a doctor's report that described us, the hostages, like this. Some wept, some were petrified, others were silent or courageous, fatalistic, cheerful, exhausted. I read news coverage and watched television broadcasts. On the evening news one night, White House correspondent Dan Rather reported that US military intervention was unlikely, save for, quote, some disaster out there in the desert. I searched for, met, and conversed with fellow hostages who were still alive. I read the manifestos of my captors and listened to their narratives, past and present. That was very important to me. And I went back to the places where everything had happened. In part, my research corroborated some of the pleasant memories I'd held on to for so many years. Some of my fellow hostages also found our captors to be good-natured and considerate. Hala Joseph, the head commando on our plane, had lost her fiancé in the 1967 war. People described her as beautiful, kind, strong-willed, and filled with pain. Dr. Ahmed Kamal, the Popular Front commando with a medical degree and sparkling dark eyes, had set up a clinic in a tent on the sand. When a young girl burned her foot on a cigarette ash, Dr. Kamal told her, "A girl with such beautiful eyes should not cry." That girl, when we spoke 48 years later, recalled Dr. Kamal as the best of them all. Once, one of the commandos caught Catherine wiping away tears. "Don't cry," he said in a way that felt fatherly. "We have children too." Now, unsurprisingly, in the course of my research, I also became aware of aspects of the hijacking far less pleasant than much of what I remembered. For one thing, there was a stream of weapons-laden visitors who filed up and down the narrow aircraft aisle. Within sight, too, were tanks and heavy artillery. A reporter described, quote, manned anti-aircraft and anti-tank guns in trenches dug round the 3 aircraft, and a big detachment of guerrillas armed with submachine guns and hand grenades standing on the alert. We were also surrounded in the distance by Jordanian army troops signaling our position in a war between Jordan and Palestinian insurgents. A representative from the International Red Cross assured us, quote, the entire world knows what is going on here, and that everyone was working on a solution, then added, we don't know if we will succeed. I also learned during my research that some of my fellow hostages had endured frightening interrogation sessions. These took place after dark And the idea was to identify Israeli soldiers or citizens for leverage in negotiations to free Palestinian prisoners in Israel. One passenger, when called by our captors, asked nearby hostages to watch her children in case she never returned. The woman's 10-year-old daughter must have overheard. The girl ran up the aisle after her mother, calling out, "I want to die with you." The commandos also questioned a young woman who possessed a photograph of an Israeli soldier, telling her, "We know you are in the Israeli army, and we are going to kill you unless you tell us more information." Just as her interrogators did not believe her denials, she convinced herself that she did not believe their threats. Holocaust survivors among the hostages faced their own demons, with confinement and weaponry stirring up unbidden memories, only intensified by the troublesome construction of Arabs as the new Nazis. One woman, 38 years old, had gone to Bergen-Belsen in a cattle car. Her captivity inside the plane brought me, she would say later in her broken English, all the memories again back from concentration camp. I was also interested during my research to find out how the press and politicians portrayed my captors. I was unsurprised to find descriptions like fanatics and madmen. More charitably, the London Sunday Times called them bourgeois intellectual revolutionaries. Other assessments were mixed. The Washington Post, for example, wrote this: "To dismiss their cause merely because some among them are criminals and mortal savages who act in a self-destructive way is an injustice to the Palestinians." Now, writing the book, I also set out to discover the contours of the demands of our captors, which was something I hadn't understood at the time, along with the negotiations for our release or its opposite. A document in the Nixon Library quoted a spokesman saying the Popular Front had brought explosives on board, ready to, quote, "destroy the planes along with their prisoners, should their demands not be met by the deadline." The commandos' ultimatum repeated in another telegram, quote, "Time period for meeting all of the demands is 72 hours. If demands are not met within this time, planes with all passengers will be blown up." I knew that everyone had returned home unharmed, but only during my research did I learn that the internal policy of the Popular Front was not to harm anyone. It was just that a successful hostage-taking mission must involve threats to the lives of the hostages. In this light, I also set out to understand the reasoning behind the tactics of my captors. Most important, the Popular Front spokesman, who was on our plane, said in September 1970, most important was that the world should ask why. Why these hijackings? And the world did ask why. You can see here the door of our plane wrapped in the Popular Front flag. On CBS News, Walter Cronkite reported that the hijackings had, and these are his words, thrust back into the world's attention a problem diplomats have tended to shunt aside, the problem of the Arabs, displaced by the creation of the State of Israel 22 years ago, a problem demanding solution if there is to be peace. The Reverend Theodore Hesburgh, president of the University of Notre Dame, said this: "Israel was created to respond to the anguish and the hopes of Jewish refugees. Need we be less imaginative and compassionate in responding to the anguish and the hopes of Palestinian refugees?" Or as Life magazine wrote, "The old dream of Palestinian nationalism is suddenly alive." Noting refugees from 1948 and 1967, quote, "scattered over the face of the earth as once were the Jews longing for a homeland." During my research, as I learned more about my fellow hostages, I also discovered something else, that my sister and I were different from most of the other American Jews on our plane. My father's parents were, in the words of one relative, world-class, non-practicing Jews. On my mother's side, My grandmother had refashioned herself from Libby Yetta to Lily Yvette. And as part of that transformation, she spoke with an affected British accent, prepared ham for Sunday dinner, and bought Easter hats for her granddaughters. Our reason for traveling to Israel also made my sister and me different. This was only 3 years after the 1967 war, when American Jews flocked to Israel, happily visiting the territories wrested from Jordan, the old city of Jerusalem, including the Western Wall, and the holy sites of Hebron, Jericho, and Bethlehem on the West Bank. No one ever took Catherine and me to those sites, and the only reason we were going to Israel was to spend the summer with our mother. In the words of one dance historian, quote, though of Jewish extraction, Linda Hodes, our mother, had never been interested in Israel or Zionism. In Israel, when we took a day trip to Lake Tiberias, I didn't know that nearly half the population had once been Palestinian. The whole day there, we wrote in a letter home to our father, was glorious as we played on our big double raft in the water, which was fresh, calm, and cool. When my mother and Israeli stepfather took my sister and me to visit friends in the artist colony of Ein Hod, we had no idea that the hundreds of Palestinians there in 1948 had been exiled to refugee camps, and the village soon resettled by Israeli artists. To our father, Catherine wrote, painters, printers, and sculptors live there in quaint little Arab-style houses, enraptured and entirely unaware of the history she was describing. Everywhere, she wrote, are beautiful mountain views and flowers. I had no idea that Palestinians had once lived in Israel because many Jews in 1970 had no idea either. The historian Omer Bartov, whose elders made their way from Eastern Europe to Palestine, lived, he wrote, next to, quote unquote, abandoned Palestinian villages. But as a child, he never once, his words, considered the origins of those ruins. Nor did the Israeli kids we played with have anything to add to this story. Israeli writer Ari Shavit, around my age, noted that his grandparents and parents had proceeded with their lives as if Palestinians, quote, never existed. Now, Catherine and I were aware that our captors wanted us to empathize with them, and we were interested in the stories they told us. This is how we live every day. This is all we have to eat. We have no homes. Children, trying to make sense of global politics in human terms, Catherine and I stirred the new history we learned in the desert into the history we already knew, then stirred the pain of our captors into our own fear and the fear of our fellow hostages. In Israel, our friends' parents had taken refuge from the Holocaust, witnessed the death of family and the loss of their homes in Europe, escaping the destruction of the Jewish people. Our captors, who bore no responsibility for the Holocaust, had in turn lost their homes in Palestine. Many of them had been raised in refugee camps. A tiny minority of Jewish settlers in Palestine, I would learn much later, understood this terrible intersection. When two Polish Holocaust survivors, arriving in their new home in Israel, found a table set for a meal, they returned the key to the Israeli government, remembering, quoting their words, how we had to leave the house and everything behind when the Germans arrived. What are your feelings about the guerrillas now, my father would ask when we got home. The Palestinians, Catherine corrected him. No anger, no resentment. This is the conversation I have on tape, thanks to my cousin, Jeremy Cole. Here we are on the day of this conversation. Less than a week after our return from the hijacking, I'm on the right. My voice comes on the tape. They have some type of point which I didn't know before I offer. They have something they are really trying to say, and they need to say it. It's pretty sad. My sister continues. I was very naive about the political aspect. I learned more, a lot more than I knew before. Their purpose was to get their homes back, and the plea of any peoples to get their homes back is a valid plea. My sister and I puzzled out the question. could Israelis and Palestinians live on the same land? Maybe it had once been possible, we thought, but there was so much anger now, so much hatred, that it didn't seem possible anymore. We couldn't think of a solution. There in the desert, Catherine and I just felt sorry for everyone. As my sister reflected years later, her words, "It's hard to look back on a personally terrifying event at a young age from an adult perspective of having a political context. For to do that," she said, "we must hold nuances in a life and death moment." We had landed in the desert on a Sunday night. On Saturday morning, our captors informed us that we would be leaving. I didn't understand everything that was swirling around me as the commandos assisted with our luggage and even hugged the little children goodbye. While writing the book, I watched raw news footage of our release, preserved by the CIA. At the time, Catherine and I didn't know where we were being taken or what was going to happen next, as we departed the desert in a van and heard the startling sounds of the 3 now empty planes exploding behind us. It was early afternoon when we arrived at the Intercontinental Hotel in the capital city of Amman, Jordan. Watching the tapes, I saw some of what I remembered. Soldiers direct our vehicle, horns honk, people speak in Arabic. 13 minutes in, the tape switches to the inside of the van. A photographer had thrust his camera straight into one of the open windows. And there we are. This is a still photograph from the film. I sit impassively, hand to cheek, shielding me, partly obscuring me. Catherine looks straight into the lens, serious, responsible, afraid. On the tape, she twists around to look out the windows, scanning the commotion, planning what to do, thinking, how can I keep us from being separated? How can I keep Martha safe? As I learned during my research, it had proven impossible for the Popular Front to break the conviction of the negotiating nations not to free hostages separately by nationality. The front had also acquiesced to the PLO's demands to get the hostages out of the desert in order to prevent a foreign military attack and for the sake of humanitarian treatment. The troubles of sanitary conditions, desert heat, and a diminishing food supply were increasing exponentially each day. When Catherine and I were released on Saturday morning, the Popular Front still held about 50 hostages, holding them in and around Amman, hoping to make headway with their negotiations. Decades later, Catherine remembered our release this way. The minute the vans turned into the Intercontinental Hotel, and I saw the big white building with flags flying and the crowds of photographers, I knew we were being released and that it was over. I wanted to grab your hand and run, but there was chaos and a crush of people. I'm going to dedicate this next passage about our arrival home at Kennedy Airport to my father, who died at the age of 98 before he had a chance to read the book. Of course, I could have given him the manuscript at any time, but I never did. I saw my father before he saw us. He was so pale that the words white as a sheet leapt into my mind. Then he saw us and bolted forward, and we saw him too. He broke into a run, and so did we, the scene I'd imagined so many times coming to life. My father folded his arms around both of us at the same time. "Oh, Dad," Catherine said, "we were so worried about you." While I was writing the book, I asked my father, "Did you ever think we were going to die?" "No," he said right away. "I always knew you were coming back. Not for a second," he told me, "did I think otherwise." My stepmother remembered it differently, though. She described my father during those days and nights as a man on another planet, stoic, frozen, devastated. "Was he thinking of never getting you back?" she said. "Well, yes. Killed and never coming back? Oh, yes." We did come back, of course, and all our fellow hostages came home by the end of September, when the Palestinian insurgents knew they were losing the war with Jordan. Ultimately, the Popular Front gained recognition for their cause, but their tactics of hijacking and hostage-taking also harmed their reputation worldwide, including among many who supported their cause. Ultimately, too, the Marxist-Leninist Popular Front would be supplanted by Hamas, which is not a member of the Palestine Liberation Organization. Well, my hijacking was published in June 2023, just a few months before October 7th, and here we are, 1 year later. Since October 7th of last year, my heart, and I mean literally my heart, has been in a state of perpetual anxiety, pounding and racing that no amount of deep breathing or meditation can cure. This isn't only because there are hostages in the news and because some of those hostages are children. It's also because of the slaughter and suffering and destruction in Gaza. And now the war in Lebanon and the actions of Iran have opened a new chapter. The experience of the hijacking and everything I learned in writing the book has only reinforced my awareness that history did not begin on October 7th. Part of what makes my heart pound is thinking back to the words my sister said just days after we returned from the Jordan Desert. This is also part of the conversation I have on tape. That day in 1970, Catherine said, "I think it would be wonderful if the Palestinians and the Israelis could live together." Then on the tape, my 13-year-old sister recalled someone around us saying that Israelis and Palestinians would never be able to live together because, quote, "although it might have been possible before, I don't know how possible it's going to be now because so much hate has been built up." And that was more than 50 years ago. When my mother moved to Israel, she married an Israeli, a man my sister and I loved dearly. My stepfather's father had arrived in Palestine from the Ukraine at age 16 and would participate in the first Zionist Congress in Switzerland in 1897. My stepfather's mother was born near Jerusalem and lost her first sweetheart in 1929 in a conflict that could be described either as a morally indefensible massacre or a morally justified rebellion against colonialism. My stepfather died long ago, but I remain close to my Israeli aunt and uncle, now in their 80s, who live 7 miles from the Lebanon border. They are my touchstones in these terrible times. Shortly after October 7th of last year, my Aunt Afra wrote to me, "We belong to a minority who oppose strongly the war in Gaza. The wise people are very much against bombing Gaza for many reasons, morally, politically, and practically, as this will not solve the problem." My Uncle Avner wrote, "The suffering in Gaza is so distressing. The situation just seems to get worse since our government is intent on continuing to destroy Gaza and its population." All this past year, I've been thinking about the concept of radical empathy, put forward by the writer Colin McCann, in which people try to understand one another through storytelling. Two people tell their stories to each other, then each retells the story from the point of view and in the voice of the other. When I think about radical empathy, I think about the organizations that work to bring together Israelis and Palestinians. These include Parent Circle Families Forum, Combatants for Peace, Standing Together, Hand in Hand, A Land for All. In these organizations, Israelis and Palestinians grieve together for those they have lost. They hold joint memorial ceremonies. They speak and they listen. They work against revenge and vengeance. A woman whose father was killed by Hamas said this, "You cannot stop violence with violence. We tried it, and it's not working." A man whose 10-year-old daughter was killed by an Israeli soldier said this, "We must share this land. Otherwise, we will share this same piece of land as the graveyard for our kids." In a recent article on the website Truth Out, my sister Catherine wrote these words, "What the families of today's hostages are enduring is indescribably searing. Will they find comfort in the deaths of tens of thousands of people in the names of their loved ones? And indeed, listen to these words by an Israeli mother who belongs to Parent Circle, whose son was killed by a Palestinian sniper. One of the first things I said when David was killed was, "You cannot kill anybody in the name of my child." My Uncle Avner in Israel told me that these courageous idealists, his words, are much reviled in Israel. They are also reviled by many Palestinians and their allies. It's so hard to champion humanity, Avner wrote to me, when all around us it is being desecrated. I tell my students history doesn't have an end, but books about history do. And so to close, I'll share with you part of the ending of my story, which took place in the summer of 2019, when I returned to the site of my hijacking with my husband, Bruce, by my side. "So, this is your first official visit to Jordan," says our guide, Salah Kleifat, trim in his blue jeans and green short-sleeve shirt. Though his degree is in economics, Salah has a special interest in travelers who care about history and politics. That makeshift desert airstrip where we landed in 1970 no longer exists, now buried beneath the buildings of a recently constructed defense plant. From the highway, our driver pulls onto a narrow paved road, then a dirt road, until we come to a stop near a trash dump with feral dogs scrounging in the detritus. Crunching across the powdery lime that covers our shoes in white dust, we find ourselves on a high point, peering down at the place where my hijacked plane sat stranded. At your time in 1970, this was just desert, Salah says. Almost 50 years later, there's a steel factory and part of a petroleum refinery rising to our west, and the newest part of the city of Zarqa spreads out behind us. The sand, I think, would be in that area, Salah says, pointing to a low ridge and the hills farther on. Comparing the coordinates of the satellite image to his cell phone compass, my husband Bruce determines that we're less than half a mile away. We're standing on the crest where reporters coming from Amman caught sight of the three airplanes, laid out like children's toys or three dots on a domino. Envisioning Catherine and me, two young hostages, Bruce loses his composure behind his sunglasses. An occasional brush of wind relieves the solid morning heat, which seems suddenly familiar. I remember that it was hot like this, I say. The airplane doors were open and sometimes the breeze would come in. Bruce is taking pictures, scanning with his camera. "Take your time, guys, not to rush," Salah says. "You can tag the photos with your location." "Yes, they'll be GPS tagged," Bruce says, steadying his voice. After such a nightmare, Salah says, to come back and see the place where these things happened is something. This is the advantage of being a child at the time, because you hadn't any idea about what's going on. Yes, there was so much I didn't know and understand in 1970 at 12 years old. But years later, I found I wanted to remember and to understand. When historians write accounts of our own participation in world historical events, it gives us the opportunity to feel more deeply the imperative for complexity, to feel more deeply the imperative for empathy. Empathy, I believe, requires acknowledging complexity, and acknowledging complexity requires empathy. At least that has been my experience, and I thank you for listening.
Were you the only children on the flight, and there was just a sea of adults? I mean, there were three planes, and...
Yeah, great question. We were far from the only children on the flight, and there were many other, or quite a few other unaccompanied children. There was one 6-year-old girl who was flying all by herself. The significance of that is that my sister and I were 12 and 13, so we weren't quite the youngest children who the crew and the stewardesses, as we called them in those days, paid attention to. But we also weren't the 15, 16, 17-year-old teenagers who formed a group among themselves. And so in a funny way, we fell between the cracks. And although there were other children on the plane, and we did become friends with some of them, we were on our own quite a bit. We were not quite young enough nor quite old enough to be comrades with some of the other children.
What was it like trying to track down and connect with other folks affected by the hijacking?
Yeah, also a wonderful question. It occurred to me right away that many of the people I was looking for were no longer alive because it was 50 years later. So most of the people I found had been quite young, had been young adults or teenagers. I also found, I had found the passenger lists, and I found that I didn't remember or know who most of them were. So what I did was I focused on the people I remembered, and those are the people I tried to get in touch with, and many I did get in touch with. With a few exceptions, one of the stewardesses did not want to speak with me, and she told me that through somebody else at TWA, and I completely understood. But almost everybody else was interested and eager, and what was interesting was many of the other people who had been young on the plane had had the same experience we had had, which was when we got home, people thought it would be better for us not to talk about it, and that was kind of the wisdom in 1970. There wasn't any debriefing or any counseling. And so when I got in touch with people and said, I'm writing this book, they were eager to talk. And many of them who had been, I was starting 7th grade, my sister was starting 9th grade, many of them who had been in high school had just gotten home and gone right back to school and applied for college and taken their SATs. And so people were eager to share experiences. And that, as a researcher, was such a gift, because when you're working with memories, one of the things that make something reliable is if many people remember something similar. And so I was able to gather that kind of information, and that was very valuable to me. Thank you for that question.
As a college professor, I know that you're watching a lot of the demonstrations and that you're much closer than some of us who are just out here working. A lot of these college students have very strong opinions. What is your take on how they are approaching things, and how might you want them to go about with expressing what they feel?
Yeah, that's a wonderful question. Obviously, NYU is in the middle of this. A friend and colleague of mine, the political writer Adam Schatz, people may have read his work. He writes for The Nation. He writes for the London Review of Books, Times Literary Supplement. His advice, we conversed about this, Adam's advice was look to the students for the fact that there's a crisis, not for the nuance. And I think he's right about that. I do think many of the universities have acted dishonorably in terms of academic freedom and free speech. I also think that, and I kind of hate to use left and right, but it is such a polarized world, and I feel like in different ways, people on the right have wanted no censorship for white supremacists to come and speak on campus. People on the left have wanted censorship for speakers who make people feel discomfort, and now they're on opposite sides, and they're struggling with that. If I had any advice, and I know that a lot of people will disagree with me about this, and that's okay. There's so many arguments over vocabulary, and I feel like the words that are used stop the conversation. So the word I'm thinking of is genocide. And there is, genocide is defined as an intention to destroy a population. So it's a word that can be used. It's not about specific numbers. But saying that word is a complete ending of conversation. And then people argue about that word. And so sometimes in my heart, I wish that we can talk about slaughter, we can talk about starvation, we can talk about disease without having to argue about the vocabulary. So, that's not something that students are eager to hear. I also, the last thing I'll say about this is that many of the universities have been deeply concerned with anti-Semitism, and of course, anti-Semitism is on the rise alarmingly. At the same time, so not but and, Islamophobia is phenomenally on the rise, phenomenally. And the Islamic and Muslim students, this is true at NYU, they're afraid to report what they're experiencing, the harassment, people spitting on them, shouting at them, blocking their paths, the same thing that's being reported from the Jewish students. None of the students should have to suffer that. And free speech, and this is the law, pure and simple, it stops at conduct that is dangerous to other people. Now, that's not the same thing as feeling discomfort. And in fact, I heard Michael Roth, president of Wesleyan University, speak recently about this, where he would say to the students, you have the right to speak, and you have the right, not to have your way blocked into class, but I cannot help you if you feel discomfort. This is what a university is. We speak, we listen. And really my last answer to your question is, I wish there was more listening going on.
I thought it was interesting when you spoke about being off of the airplane with your captors, and I just wonder if you could let us know a little bit more what that week of life was like.
Yeah, sure.
Were you in the cabin
Sure.
23 hours or whatever? And then also you mentioned that the front is kind of dissolved in Hamas, but isn't that a rather superficial way to describe those two organizations? Can you just inform us?
Yes, so the second question first. I didn't mean to say that the Popular Front had dissolved in Hamas. I meant to say that, so the aftermath of the hijacking, the Popular Front lost the war with Jordan, with the Jordanian army, and they were ejected from Jordan, and most of their leadership moved to Lebanon. They acted on their beliefs from Lebanon for quite some time, and then the 1982 war against Lebanon, between Israel and Lebanon, was a way to rout the Popular Front and the PLO out of Lebanon. So the Popular Front was this radical Marxist-Leninist faction, and Israel had a hand in supporting Hamas in the Gaza elections of 2006 because the Israeli government wanted to divide the Palestinians between the Palestinian Authority, which ruled the West Bank, and Hamas, which Israel understood were a theocratic group, but Israel was, they felt that Hamas would be a less dangerous entity for them, wrongly, than the radical left side. So they were willing to prop up Hamas. What that means is that the Popular Front, in the ensuing years, and by the way, in 1972, the Popular Front gave up on hijacking, and in the 1990s, along with the PLO, but especially one of the head commandos on our plane, one I didn't speak about, Bassam Abu Sharif, accepted a two-state solution. So what happened was the Popular Front fragmented and became quite marginalized within the PLO. They do still exist, but they've been, I guess the word is maybe overtaken in terms of on-the-ground leadership by Hamas in Gaza. I hope that's a sufficient answer. It's a very complex story, and I've done as much as I can to learn about it. Conditions on the plane, we were in what was called tourist class, coach class. We were little kids. We were skinny little girls, so in that sense, I think we felt like we had some room. We also had two seats. The woman next to us found another seat somewhere else. It was very hot during the day, very hot, and quite cold at night. And our stewardesses ended up pulling down the curtains and cutting them up into blankets for people. It was so hot during the day that women would cut the sleeves out of their dresses, and then you'd be freezing at night. The bathrooms were beyond horrible. There was no electricity, and airplane bathrooms flush by electricity. I write about that in the book. The food, our captors shared all the food they had with us. Meals were flown in by the International Red Cross, so we had a hot meal every so often. But by the end of the week, it was as I wrote in my diary, we're living on pita bread and water. Oh dear, as I wrote in my diary. So it was very uncomfortable. We were permitted outside the plane, maybe every couple of days or so, and that's where the kids would jump rope, and the crew blew up the life rafts, and little kids all sat in the life raft, and people read them stories, and the commandos gave piggyback rides to little kids. And one of my memories is, we were in the middle of a desert, and so there was a mirage of water on the horizon, and I thought we were on an island. And one of the commandos, kneeled down on the sand and explained to us what a mirage was and how it worked scientifically. So that was one of my memories. So it was very unpleasant. We didn't have access to our luggage. We were all wearing the same clothes. There were sandstorms twice during the week where the sand came rushing into the plane before we could get all the doors shut, and that was unbelievable. I mean, it was just like we were statues covered with sand. So it was very unpleasant, but we all did what we could, and then we eventually left. And as my sister said, as Jeremy said, when the New York Times reporter thrust his microphone in front of Catherine and said, "What are you going to do now?" she said, "Thank God and have a bath." So, yeah.
What motivates you to kind of like conduct your research through comparing memories and documents instead of like using other approaches?
So as a historian, I've written several books about the 19th century, and I go to archives and I read letters, journals, government documents. That's what I'm used to doing. Now, certain documents are based on memory. So if you read a court case from, 1850, and a lawyer asks somebody in the courtroom, what happened in this case, that's going to be based on memory, but we read it as a document. So the thing about writing this book that was so different was that I had memories of my own, although as I said in the talk, they were very hazy and very fragmented. What I did, and I write about this a little bit in the book, was before I started my research, I wrote down everything I remembered so that I wouldn't be influenced by my research, although once I started researching, it felt like memories were coming back to me. But I also did a lot of reading about memory, and it's really hard to know if that's real or if you're just fabricating it from what you're reading. So it's hard to know. But I've never written a book like this before. I never worked with my own memories, and because I was a historian of the 19th century, I had never, I have colleagues who do oral histories for people who were alive during whatever they're writing about. And I had never done that. So that's what I was saying earlier, that because I have this passion for evidence and accuracy as a historian, the comparing of memory and documents is a way to try to test out reliability. If one person says something happened but nobody else remembers it, it's not as reliable a memory. Also, the other thing I learned is the closer you are to the time something happened, the more reliable. So the interview that we did a week after we got home, maybe 5 or 6 days, that's going to be more reliable than somebody thinking about it weeks, months, or years later. I also was very fortunate that a number of the hostages I contacted gave me their own memories. One from a woman who had written them as soon as she'd gotten home. Another from a young man on the plane who I remembered very well, who was no longer alive, but his son sent me a manuscript that his father had started to write. And in the manuscript, he remembers Catherine and me, remembers talking with us. And the only record I have of him, his name was Mitch, was in my diary. I said something like, "We have lots of friends on the plane," and Mitch was the first name I wrote down. So you can see that kind of, that's what historians look for, that kind of congruence and collaboration among sources. And that was a really interesting and important journey for me. Thank you.
So you mentioned how the Red Cross was a big part of helping this conflict. And to me, they seem like an essential third-person perspective in such conflicts. So I wanted to know if you think if there's ever really a true third-person perspective when everybody seems to have their own opinions and experiences in such a conflict.
Yeah, so the question, in case you didn't hear it, was about the Red Cross as a kind of, as the questioner said, as a third-person perspective, but is it ever possible to have that kind of perspective when everybody has an opinion? So the International Committee for the Red Cross, which our captors consented to coming out to the desert and to be negotiators, were meant to be a neutral, exactly as you said, a neutral third party. Their first concern was the release of the hostages, and then their second concern was the health of the hostages. It turned out, as you implied in your question, it turned out to be quite complicated. The Red Cross was already in Jordan because there was a war going on, and so they were already there as medics. The Red Cross workers may well have had their own opinions, and what I learned was the head negotiator was a gentleman named André Rochat, and he wrote a memoir about this. And apparently he did have his own strong opinions, and he also had a very, according to other people, I don't have any memory of him being on the plane, although apparently he was. According to other people, he had quite a big ego and quite a big stake in releasing the hostages under his name, that he would be the hero. But he also, I found in his own writings, places where he said, we just don't know if we're going to be able to do this. This may not happen. So I do think that the Red Cross negotiators followed all of the rules of a neutral third party. So one of those rules was no hostages can be released they can't be divided by nationality. They can all be released or none of them can be released. And they stuck to that. As the negotiations went on, the Popular Front said, we'd like to release the women and children. And the Red Cross said, okay, we can do that under the Geneva Convention. Women and children should not be part of these wartime negotiations. But the 4 nations who were negotiating said no, that was not possible because it was breaking that the rule about dividing by nationality. So the Red Cross did their job, but it was also clear from the sources I read that they both sympathized with the hostages and empathized with the Palestinians. And they did what they could. Personally, they did whatever they did, but they did follow the rules of a neutral third-party negotiator. I'm not going to come up there, but can you talk about the misconception of Jews and non-Jews being separated? And who were the few hostages that actually were released the day after we landed? Yeah, so that was my sister, Catherine. Those are important points. So first of all, when we landed in the desert, the next day, a large group of hostages were let go. These were people who were not valuable to the Popular Front as part of the negotiation. So they were from certain nations. So there was a large contingent of South Asian travelers who were let go. They weren't part of the negotiation. The people who the Popular Front were interested in were Americans, Israelis, West Germans, and British. And that's because there were different Palestinian prisoners in different jails in different European countries for various acts. This is very important. A big misconception that I found when I was writing the book was that the Popular Front separated Jews from non-Jews, let all the non-Jews go, and kept all the Jews. It is such an embedded misconception. You can find it in the Wikipedia article about our hijacking. You can find it in a PBS show that was done about our hijacking years ago. You could even find it in the 50th anniversary article of the Jerusalem Post, in the 50th anniversary of the hijacking. Okay, not true, but the reason it was a misconception, I came to realize, is because what happened was very confusing. The second night on the plane, many of the hostages were taken out onto the sand at night, and it was frightening. And then names were read off a list, and the people whose names were read were brought in vans to the capital city of Amman. Everybody who was released from our plane was not Jewish, and that's where the misconception started, because the Popular Front released Jews from the Swiss airplane that night. They were not valuable to them. They did not have connections to Israel. The Swiss airplane had been flying, it hadn't gone through Israel. I think it had been flying from Zurich to New York. And many, many people on our plane were non-Jews. One night during the week, 6 men were taken away. 3 of them were Jews, 3 of them were non-Jews. Of the 50 hostages who were held longer, 2/3 of them were not Jewish. Now, part of the problem is the Popular Front was very clear. We make a distinction between Jews and Zionists. We have nothing against Jews. Zionists, took our homes away. That's their definition. The trouble is, when we landed, they collected all our passports and they asked every passenger a number of questions. One of the questions they asked us was, are you Jewish? Now, their purpose in asking that was they were trying to find people with connections to Israel for their negotiations. However, as diplomats noted later on, if they are trying to present themselves to the world as people who have nothing against the Jews but only against Zionists, that was a tactical error, because that's what made the hostages feel as if the Jews and non-Jews were being separated. I do believe that the Popular Front realized that. After that night, they never made that distinction again, and they were very clear that was not important to them. They were trying to find the hostages who would be most valuable in releasing Palestinians from Israeli prisons. So, in sum, it's an unfortunate remnant of memory that's not true, and yet important to understand where the confusion came from. And actually, when I was listening to the tape from Jeremy, it was very interesting to me because my sister and I were confused, and we kind of had this little back and forth on the tape, like they let all the non-Jews go. No, they didn't. Oh yeah, I thought they did. It's like we were confused. We didn't know what had happened, and I was very interested in my research to try to sort that out, and to try to make sense of where that fit into the convictions of the Popular Front and the experiences of the hostages. Thank you. Okay.
So thank you very much. We have a gift for you. We have a copy of We Are Not Able to Live in the Sky, The Seductive Promise of Microfinance by Mara Curtis Nelson, as referenced by Steve Spellman. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
So
Thank you.